Gabriel Garcia Marquez is one of my favorite writers for his storytelling, but even more, I think, for the beauty and precision of his prose. Now, whether it's the opening line from 100 Years of Solitude or the fantastical stream of consciousness in Autumn of the Patriarch, where the words rush by page after page of unpunctuated imagery, sweeping the reader along like some wild river twisting through a primal South American jungle, reading Marquez is a visceral experience. Which struck me as particularly remarkable during one session with the novel, when I realized that I was being swept along on this remarkable, vivid journey in translation. Now, I was a comparative literature major in college, which is like an English major, only instead of being stuck studying Chaucer for 3 months, we got to read great literature in translation from around the world. And as great as these books were, you could always tell that you weren't getting close to the full effect. But not so with Marquez, who once praised his translator's versions as being better than his own, which is an astonishing compliment. So when I heard that the translator, Gregory Rabassa, had written his own book on the subject, I couldn't wait to read it. It's called, apropos of the Italian adage that I lifted from his foreword, If This Be Treason. And it's a charming read. It's highly recommended for anyone who's interested in the translator's art. But the reason that I mention it is that early on, Rabassa offers this elegantly simple insight. Every act of communication is an act of translation. Now, maybe that's been obvious to all of you for a long time, but for me, as often as I'd encountered that exact difficulty on a daily basis, I had never seen the inherent challenge of communication in so crystalline a light. Ever since I can remember thinking consciously about such things, communication has been my central passion. Even as a child, I remember thinking that what I really wanted most in life was to be able to understand everything and then to communicate it to everyone else. So, no ego problems. It's funny, my wife Daisy, whose family is littered with schizophrenics, and I mean littered with them, once said to me, Chris, I already have a brother who thinks he's God. I don't need a husband who wants to be. Anyway, as I plunged through my 20s, ever more aware of how unattainable the first part of my childhood ambition was, it was that second part, being able to successfully communicate to others whatever knowledge I was gaining, where the futility of my quest really set in. Time after time, whenever I set out to share some great truth with a soon-to-be grateful recipient, it had the opposite effect. Interestingly, when your opening line of communication is, hey, listen up because I'm about to drop some serious knowledge on you, it's amazing how quickly you'll discover both ice and the firing squad. Finally, after about 10 years of alienating friends and strangers alike, I finally got it that a new personal truth all my own, that if I was going to ever communicate well with other people, the ideas that I was gaining, I'd better find a different way of going about it. And that's when I discovered comedy. Now, comedy travels along a distinct wavelength from other forms of language. If I had to place it on an arbitrary spectrum, I'd say it falls somewhere between poetry and lies. And I'm not talking about all comedy here, because clearly there's plenty of humor that colors safely within the lines of what we already think and feel. What I want to talk about is the unique ability that the best comedy and satire has at circumventing our ingrained perspectives. Comedy as the philosopher's stone, that takes the base metal of our conventional wisdom and transforms it through ridicule into a different way of seeing and ultimately being in the world. Because that's what I take from the theme of this conference, gained in translation. That it's about communication that doesn't just produce greater understanding within the individual, but leads to real change. Which in my experience means communication that manages to speak to and expand our concept of self-interest. Now, I'm big on speaking to people's self-interest because we're all wired for that. It's part of our survival package, and that's why it's become so important for us, and that's why we're always listening at that level. And also because that's where, in terms of our own self-interest, we finally begin to grasp our ability to respond, our responsibility to the rest of the world. Now, as to what I mean by the best comedy and satire, I mean work that comes first and foremost from a place of honesty and integrity. Now, if you think back on Tina Fey's impersonations on Saturday Night Live of the newly nominated vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin, they were devastating. Fey demonstrated far more effectively than any political pundit the candidate's fundamental lack of seriousness, cementing an impression that the majority of the American public still holds today. And the key detail of this is that Fey's scripts weren't written by her, and they weren't written by the SNL writers. They were lifted verbatim from Palin's own remarks. Here was a Palin impersonator quoting Palin word for word. Now that's honesty and integrity, and it's also why Fey's performances left such a lasting impression. On the other side of the political spectrum, the first time that I heard Rush Limbaugh refer to presidential hopeful John Edward as the Breck Girl, I knew that he'd made a direct hit. Now, it's not often that I'm going to associate the words honesty and integrity with Limbaugh. But it's really hard to argue with that punchline. The description perfectly captured Edward's personal vanity, and guess what? That wound up being the exact personality trait that was the core of the scandal that ended his political career. Now, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart is by far the most It's by far the most well-documented example of the effectiveness of this kind of comedy. Survey after survey, from Pew Research to the Annenberg Center for Public Policy, has found that Daily Show viewers are better informed about current events than the viewers of all major network and cable news shows. Now, whether this says more about the conflict between integrity and profitability of corporate journalism than it does about the attentiveness of Stewart's viewers, the larger point remains that Stewart's material is always grounded in a commitment to the facts. Not because his intent is to inform, it's not. His intent is to be funny. It just so happens that Stewart's brand of funny doesn't work unless the facts are true. And the result is great comedy that's also an information delivery system that scores markedly higher in both credibility and retention than the professional news media.